Maya, welcome. Maya Sharfi is a career and executive coach who helps women advance to executive leadership roles and thrive within them. She helps women navigate bias in the workplace and ensures that it doesn't hold them back. Maya is the founder of Build Yourself, an executive coaching company dedicated to helping women lead more boldly and impactfully while increasing work-life balance. She specializes in the areas of tech, design, and innovation. Maya, thank you so much for taking part in this conversation titled Navigating Workplace Bullying, Finding Resilience, and Feeling Joy Even in Crisis. Hi, Maya.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. So, we had a chance to talk last week, and obviously, I've read quite a bit about you and the things you're working on and focuses that you have in your business. So, let me just ask a couple things. There's a quote you have about I help women leaders achieve more by doing less. I think we'd all like to do that. Um, but you're saying it's time to lead more boldly and end perfectionism. Can you kind of describe that? Because I think holistically, that kind of describes your approach to helping the women you're consulting and coaching.
Yeah, so I specialize in helping women get to the next level. So sometimes that means getting a new job, using a job to not just move laterally, but also moving upwards or getting a promotion. And there's two places where I see that challenge of perfectionism show up. Number one, in that advancement search, right? That advancement process. So feeling like, actually, maybe some of your listeners have heard there's a study of men and women applying for jobs. And one of the things that they found in the study was that women were more likely than men to say, oh, I only meet 4 out of 5 qualifications. I can't apply to this job. Whereas men were more likely than women to say, 3 out of 5, I'm going to be great. I'm going to be such
I've
you
never
know?
heard that, but that seems to make sense intuitively. Okay.
So, and so a lot of this has to do with, I know we're going to talk about this more, but like very subtle bias, right? Like bias isn't something men do to women; it's something we all do to everyone. And, women, right? Women are less likely to afford themselves that extra, sense of credit, and actually, employers are also less likely to afford that to women. So one of the things we see, and this is another study, but we see that promotion decisions for men in one study uh, were based on men's future potential, right? Oh, we could see him doing this thing, whereas those decisions for women were based on her past accomplishments. So she's done this before, so she can do it again. So we're giving
Yeah.
men that extra benefit of the doubt, right? So I see it when it comes to people going after the next role, feeling
Uh,
ready to go after it, putting their hat in the ring. But then I also see it when they're in the role where, um, we have a lot of women who are just feeling so overwhelmed. They're more in the weeds than they want to be. They struggle to kind of pull out and be strategic, and they're burning themselves out. And part of it is that the very way that they got here is not what's going to get them there, because those skills of dotting every I, crossing every T, being perfect in this. And you and I are going to talk about this more, but especially
yeah.
if you're in an environment where there are fewer women in the room, the higher you rise in leadership, you can also get questioned more. And that can make you feel like you have to do all this extra stuff just to be taken seriously. And so my ultimate mission is to help women thrive in positions of leadership. And that means getting them there, but that also means making sure that that they can thrive. And that means having a life outside of work. And that means being in touch with your genius because you're not worried that people are questioning everything you're going to say.
Yeah. And so many people, women especially, want to do this, but then you've got to somehow encourage or embolden or find a culture that it will allow you to have this kind of cliche work-life balance. So even if you desire that, how do you find it? And how do you keep
Yeah. And how do you keep it? So, I mean, the first piece is finding an aligned culture, right? And an aligned culture, I think sometimes we're black and white about culture, right? We're like, oh, like I had a client, for example, who moved from one field to another, and she was worried that that field there wouldn't be work life balance. But there's actually so much specificity in individual cultures or your specific role, or what do you expect it to do? Like, for example, there are some fields where you have really busy seasons and then things are a little slower, or you have to give up more of your nights, but actually you have so much more flexibility during your day. So I think it's worth looking for an aligned culture, but it's also worth questioning your black and white thoughts about this is how there's no work life balance here or there is there, right? And so some of those factors can be like um, a boss who works all the time, that could be a factor. But also sometimes there are bosses who work all the time and don't expect the same thing from the people who report to them. So I think those are some things to think about. But then there's so much in our own behavior that influences how how we're perceived in terms of work-life balance. So I'll just give an example to bring this to life. So I have a client who was in one of my group coaching programs, and she came and her goal, she worked 14-hour days every day. And she had this goal. She's like, I want to work a 9-hour day, 1 day a week. And we are like, it's just so funny, right? Because it's like,
Sounds reasonable. Okay.
but so, and like for her, that would have been like so much time, free time, right? So, and the funny thing was, so we worked with her on, we put her on something that I call a no diet, where you practice saying no, right? And so she said no to something. She was like, oh, what I realized is that all of these other people were coming to me with their extra work because I was always the one who was going to say yes. And then you're like, oh, she can't do it. Oh, I guess I'm going to go have to figure out how to get this done myself. And so there are so many subtle ways. Like I would even say that 60 to 70% of the work of clearing out your schedule for women is actually what you do and how you show up. And so much of it is subtle. Like you don't even realize you're volunteering for things that are not actually necessary to volunteer for. It's like, wait, put that hand down. Why am I raising my hand for this?
Yeah.
And then I would say maybe about 20, 30, 40% of it is actually like finding that right fit context. So
Well, I guess you do have to kind of take control if you can. And let me ask you about another quote. And this gets into um, kind of my approach and my interest, which is incivility in the workplace, which I'm sure contributes to uh, some of the uh, disenchantment that your clients feel at times as they're working harder, grinding, and that's just not working for them as well anymore. You talked about a client, I believe, who you were coaching, and she said something to the effect of, and I love this quote, she knew she'd fail on the way to succeeding and then fail again, and she would let that be okay, which I find is so interesting. And I'll give you my perspective on it. But what did that mean to her, and what did that mean to you as her consultant and coach?
so I'm not remembering who it was because I think that's something that I usually will tell my clients.
Okay.
But the transition into those more senior levels of leadership, especially for women who are socialized more than men to make sure that everything's right and to keep everybody else happy, is often an unlearning of what got you here. So, what got you to this point in your career, right? We see this sometimes with women in middle management or like lower level senior leadership is doing things the right way, always being ahead of the pack. You know, some of the behaviors, right? Even we can even trace it back to school sometimes. Being the one who always coordinated the group program, right? Or group project, right?
Yeah.
But those very skills are skills that keep you in the weeds, that keep you thinking small, that keep you pleasing people, and you can't please everyone in senior leadership because you have to make kind of clear decisions between one way of doing things and the other, and there are winners and losers. And there are strategies, and I know you and I are going to talk a little bit about inclusion, but there are strategies for women to not face social pushback when they do have to communicate. Here's a winner, here's a loser, and we can talk about those if those are helpful. But um, and so those very skills that got you here of doing things quote unquote the right way and making everyone happy and pleasing the teacher are the skills that are actually going to hold you back or burn you out from that next level of actually making an impact, making strategic decisions, um, really influencing change at the very top.
Well, what struck me about that quote to me, and what resonated with me was that I was in television for my entire career, and working really hard to move up, and I created my own shows and executive produced my own shows, but I didn't have that perspective that, and there was a level of success, but then invariably the show would get canceled, usually much earlier than I would have liked. And then it felt like a failure. And I'm wondering if that's contributing to kind of the burnout, because that was very debilitating to me. It didn't feel like a success, even though I created a show, got it on the air, hired a staff, all that kind of stuff. It still felt like a failure. And it sounds like a lot of the people you're working with are doing good things, but ultimately the outlook or the perspective they have it on it is negative. At least it was for me. And then that causes burnout, as opposed to like the black and white thinking of looking at it more in gray terms, like, hey, we did this. Yes, it would have been great if it went on for 20 years, but that's not really realistic.
Yeah. Well, this is why I do this work, right? So to frame what's happening, the further up we go, the less clear the rubric for success is, right? Like, let's think back to school, right? There was an assignment, you could get an A. If you were, it was oftentimes like the teacher made clear for you, this is what success looked like. And most of the time you could differentiate yourself by just working harder, right?
Yeah.
So many of us want to contribute something through our work, right? And it's not always like a big purpose thing, but I really believe that I want to die empty, right? I want to die like knowing that I showed up the way that like made a contribution that truly came for me and been more my
Yeah.
than anybody else, right? And that looks different for everybody. And that's one of the things I love about being a career and executive coach is like, one of my clients who's in marketing like, is all about like transforming consumer behavior. And like that's totally different than my client who is like really analytically focused and really cares about um like really wants to build like systems and compliance, right? So like it's all unique to your own the own
Sure.
things that drive you, right? And so what happens is when we get to a point where the success isn't always clear, there's a lot of failures, there's a lot of ups and downs. Um, what can happen is many of us have been trained to decide to be happy on the other side of achieving a goal. And so I'll be really personal here. I
Yeah.
had this dream that my business would be at a certain place before I had a kid. And it was totally driven by, fears of what if I won't be able to do work-life balance? Here's the kind of support in the home that I want to be able to afford. Here's what will mean that I can hire the support staff so that things will be easier. And I didn't get there. And so then I pushed myself really hard after my daughter was born, and then I burned out. And I had to go, I'd been a coach for a while, but this is why even coaches need coaches, right? So I
Yeah.
had to go through a process of realizing that I had put be happy, be comfortable, be safe, enjoy life on the other side of that business goal. And it meant that I couldn't be happy until I got there. And everything was about achieving that goal. And then when I really looked back, I realized that goalpost had shifted over and
Yeah.
over and over. It was this milestone at that point. It was this number there. And I see that happen a lot with my clients where it's like, okay, well, let me get to this title and then I'll feel good and I'll feel recognized and I'll feel, you know. And so the real craft is to actually figure out how do you have those feelings now instead of on the other side of the goal, right? For me, the big shift was saying, okay, how do I feel safe now? How do I, and then what feelings do I want to have now? And, the feelings I want to have is I love creating content and putting stuff in the world that helps women. I love coaching and like, wait, I get to have that now, right? And so I think there's a parallel to think about how would you be relating to your shows if success wasn't and it goes on for this many seasons, right? Like how would you be really or even, I know you have a book in the world, right? So like
Yeah.
how do you have the feelings you want to have now? And what are the thoughts you need to have in order to have those feelings? And then the goal is still important because the goal drives us to grow, right? So I still want to have a business goal. I still want to, there's still things that I want to achieve. And the business goal forces me to transform my level of coaching mastery, my level of, like I have two books that I'm going to be putting into the world in the next few years, right? Like it drives me to take those actions, but I get to feel how I want to feel before the goal gets achieved. Does that make sense, Andy?
Yeah. In fact, this is an aside, and I'll make it really brief, but Rick Rubin, who's one of the top music producers,
Yeah.
uh, had put a book out about 2 years ago about it's about the art, right? And you can be a construction worker. You don't have to be a traditional artist, but in your coaching, in my trying to create television shows, it's the art of doing. and then putting it out in the world, it really shouldn't be about, okay, I need to make $1 million, or I need to make $10,000, or I need to get an Emmy award. If you keep looking for, and I think a lot about this external validation as being the goal, at least in my world, in my experience, you're going to be ultimately disappointed in almost every case. Um, it's the love that you and the emotion that you show in your work that's going to be the art that's going to make the difference, not necessarily, and it may, but it may be, there may be an outcome that's good, there may be some outcomes that are bad, but it's really the art of doing that should make the difference. But, so let me ask you something else, Maya, about, because yes, we can all try for those things, but there are external forces that do come into play, like gender bias, which I know you see, um, in your work. And so how are you seeing that, in the real world? And something that I am working on quite a bit in talking about, in, emphasizing, is how work, especially workplace bullying and incivility, can isolate and disengage people. And that certainly happens to women at a greater degree. So what are you seeing, in your office, and how is gender bias today, um, kind of rearing its ugly head, and how are you helping women through it?
Yeah. So I want to kind of frame gender bias, especially in the context of this conversation, as a almost subtle and sometimes often unintentional form of bullying. And that's weird, right? Like bias is bullying, right? Like we think of bullying as being like mean, like targeting someone. And I actually think that bias, the ultimate effect as experienced by people experienced bias. So in my case, I look at women, but we could also look at people of color. We could look at sometimes it shows up in terms of class. Um, there's all kinds of reasons, right? But like I think bias, actually, the impact of bias, it can be the same as bullying. And one of the things that makes it more difficult to address is that it's very subtle, and a lot of the time it's unintentional or even unconscious. And so I want to just share two quick anecdotes to kind of bring this to life from what I've seen with my
Wonderful.
coaching clients.
Please do.
Yeah. So one of the most common things I hear from women, especially women who are trying to grow in their career, get to the next level, they know that they need to have relationships with decision makers and people who are influential in their companies. They tell me things like, all the guys go out to lunch and they don't invite me. And I don't know how I get invited, but I don't. And I'm like, should I just like join along or should I like maybe like, and they can put the pressure on themselves of like, should I just be more assertive and like invite myself along? But then like they didn't invite me. So that feels weird. And sometimes it does feel weird when I go. And it's a really, really common thing. And it's not just lunch. It can be things like, my boss is like going out for drinks with these guys and how did they get like, I know that important things are happening in those conversations. And here's the other story I want to tell. So I have which I just think brings it to life even more. I had a client who was the only woman of color in an all white department, and she was like, people find out these like I hear about things last, right? Like we have this new strategy, or we're changing this policy, or this thing is happening, and there's this new opportunity, and I always feel like I'm the last person to find out, and it's like in those situations, we can never, like, we can't do a peer reviewed study where we clone my clients, by 10 and then we run it in 10 office. But what I think is very likely is that people connect with and socialize with people who share their background, share their gender,
Yeah.
their financial background, and they don't even realize it, but they leave people out. And the implications of that for women are twofold, right? One, you like you constantly feel left out, and that takes a huge toll, right? Do people like me? Are they thinking about me? Do they like my idea as much as this person's? Are they taking me seriously? Like we haven't even talked about like taking me seriously, which is there's even more ways that shows up. But like, and I've read there's a coach who works with people of color and works on racial inclusion, and I don't know where his figure comes from, but he thinks that it could take up to 1/3 of our mental bandwidth to worry about whether people are perceiving us differently. Are we, issues of inclusion? And like, think about just what the experience of that is and the cost of on productivity. But then,
Yeah.
but then number two, these informal conversations are where opportunities get shared and mentorship happens informally and people hear, oh, we're actually opening this new division, you actually might be a really good fit. Or, hey, do you want me to put in a word for you? And so when you're not being included, because in many of our organizations, especially as you rise to the top, many of the decision makers and people in the room are still men, women are actually getting circled out of that key intelligence, which is even more important when it comes to rising into more senior and senior roles.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough, and, I write and think a lot about, bullying and how I, for literally decades, couldn't quite figure out how to handle the bully. What was the best approach to see if I could mitigate it or stop it? Um, and only once I had a chance to look back on it have I begun to understand better how to approach those issues, but not effectively in the midst of it because you love the job, you need the paycheck. There's just a myriad of reasons why you can't just take the bully on. So let me ask this. What do you do when and, in television, I'd like to say, television has its faults, but it's very diverse, at least in my experience. There's many, many, and have been for, I'd say, the last 10, 15 years, many women leaders, and we don't have time to play golf. If you're in television news, you're not going out golfing with the guys. That's not something we did. But I know that there are still industries where they're going out for drinks. We had to cover news stories. So, given that there still are many industries where people are just doing the things and communicating more with those most like them, what do you tell the women that you're counseling and coaching? What can you do? Because it's a tough spot to interject yourself, when you're feeling like you're on the outside. It's a bad feeling, it really hurts.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I'll give three suggestions. So, I think the first is that there's a power in individual relationships. So, sometimes when there's a pack, right, it's a lot easier to kind of break down the pack like one person at a time. And not to say that you have to break down the whole pack, but if you want to make sure that you're not being circled out of key intel that's going to help you accelerate your career, pick a couple of people to build a relationship with, right? And it might mean that you need to initiate because, again, people, we can talk about this in a minute. What can people of all genders do? But like one of the things I recommend is for people to do a 5 minute, like a 1 minute mentorship audit and to write down the people who they have formal and informal mentorship relationships with and to see who shares my characteristics and who doesn't, right? So like there's stuff for them to do, but they may not be approaching you because they might be driven by bias. And so to say, hey, I'd really love to hear about this latest project that you're running or, this initiative. Can we get some coffee? And I want to, and, I also want to share a little bit about my, what I'm thinking. Can we get some coffee sometime? Sometimes women have to be aware of optics. And so I'll just do a quick note on this. So,
Please.
uh, coffee sometimes is better than drinks, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes when men and women socialize, it can be perceived that there's a romantic relationship. Sometimes, if women approach men to socialize in a work context, it can be misconstrued as romantic interest. Sometimes, men, especially more senior men, are worried about the optics of it being seen the wrong way. And so, um, one of the best pieces of advice, actually, to men in supervisory roles in terms of making sure that they mentor women more often is, and this comes from, I think this come from it either comes from Sheryl Sandberg's book or a
Yeah.
great book called, um, oh my gosh, it's by Iris Bonet, and she writes about gender inclusion. And so,
Okay.
or it could come from Susan Colantuano. Anyways, there's a lot of really brilliant people who I'm standing on the shoulders of. Oh yeah,
Okay.
Susan Colantuano. So she talks about how male mentors, there was a male mentor who realized that he was going out to drinks with his mentees, and he decided to mentor over lunch just because he didn't want to be seen going out to drinks with younger women. And
Yeah.
this was a way that he could kind of put it on an even playing field. So coffee is a good thing, right? During the workday if possible, or right after work versus like a late night thing. So that's just a little asterisk. But so individual relationships and forming those individual relationships and even maybe saying, hey, tell me about this. You guys all seem to go to lunch. I'd love to come sometime. Would you be comfortable inviting me to tag along? Right. So that's that's one of the most powerful things is making sure you have powerful individual relationships. But
Yeah.
then there's a second strategy that comes from, I think, Sheryl Sandberg's book, but she is actually originally was in Obama's cabinet. So we know from studies that people build on men's contributions in group conversations more than women, right? So like if you and I, Andy, are in a group conversation, depend in most cases, if you share an idea, people are more likely to build on it than if I share an idea.
Okay.
So in Obama's cabinet, some of the women banded together doing something called amplification, where they would actually, when they liked each other's, they would proactively try to build on each other's contributions or ideas or suggestions if they agreed with them. So that's something that women can actually do for each other, and it's something that men can actually do for women as well.
Yeah, my wife has told me that in her office, she works in domestic violence, representing domestic violence victims, and in their workplace, it's a nonprofit. Uh, they're encouraged to say yes, and because so often people are uh, inclined to a yes, but to show that they've got something more important to add to it. And so I think it's these kind of microaggressions where you feel diminished because someone says yes, but I have this idea, and I wonder if that's along the same lines.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanna share my third strategy, but maybe even before I do, I want to share with you. Sometimes we experience things as bullying or aggressive behavior, and it's actually just different backgrounds or different socialization. So I had a client who felt attacked by her fellow leadership members. They were questioning her project profitability, and she's been socialized to be more indirect and to, if you're going to say, give some negative feedback, to kind of like hide it a little bit so that no one feels bad. And they, her colleagues have not, like they grew up as men, right? And so for them, like saying something direct is just like, here's how you solve the problem. And so she felt so attacked. And I was like, I think what they're trying to say is that these projects aren't profitable. Why do you keep taking them? And they're just trying to say that so that you can have a conversation, right? Is it possible they're not attacking you? They're just trying to get to the, I'm pretty directed. So this comes up with me and my husband. And I'm like, okay, why don't you make that choice about, getting into this thing our daughter said? And he like can feel like I'm attacking. And I'm like, no, I'm just, I want to go like wash the dishes. So can we just get through this real quick? And so I just want to say that sometimes,
Yeah, I think that's fair.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um, but I love that, like being more aware of how you mean it is not always how it's perceived, I think,
yeah,
and also how the other person said it. You might be reading into that, right?
it can happen. It can happen. And I mean, do you consider this? Look, gender bias, and there are civil rights laws against it, and there's a spectrum, just like there is in bullying. There's a full spectrum. Um, in bullying, there's no real civil rights legislation against it, which is why I'm so interested in the topic. But having said that, do you consider some of these, the issues that we've been talking about, kind of microaggressions in a way, because they may not be overt? Nobody's saying, "Hey, we don't want women here." I mean, obviously, those are things that don't happen too often. If they do, they happen behind closed doors. But in terms of explaining it to your clients, are you looking at in the same way that kind of microaggressions are to all kinds of different classes?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are microaggressions
Okay.
because I think sometimes words carry connotations and aggression, microaggression, it carries a connotation. If I had to put some money on it, I would say that the vast majority of microaggressions are unintended and are
Yeah.
not um are not like someone is the person who is perpetrating the microaggressions, their intention is not to be aggressive. This is actually just like the behavior that they're used to, and it's also unconscious, right? So like I alluded to this a little bit, but women get questioned so much more than men. Women
Uh-huh.
so much more than men. And so by the time you make it into more senior levels in your career, you might have a like years of experience of people questioning what you're saying more than your colleagues, right? And so
Yeah.
are your colleagues aggressive? Are they trying to get you out of there? Probably not. But have they grew up in a world where, women are not as authoritative and seen as authoritative as men? Totally, right? And then, when you have experienced years of pushback, like it can show up in a lot of ways, right? So some of the women that I work with, really struggle with resentment and defensiveness, which are self-protection mechanisms when someone's constantly questioning us, right?
Well, I'd love to share a very quick thing that happened to me, and it was of my doing, and so but I'll share it. I, was an executive producer in my last job, and, we had to drive several hours to a very early morning production shoot. And we had to leave my house around 5 o'clock. And there was a colleague of mine, a male colleague, who lived further away. So I offered to him, or maybe I offered to him to drive to my house, sleep over at my house, and then we would drive because we had to leave at 5 in the morning, another 4 or 5 hours so that we could go together, talk about the project, and get there, comfortably. And somehow it got out, and one of my female, staffers took great issue with it. And I thought it was really interesting, and I couldn't understand why, but then I did understand why, because I probably wouldn't invite a female staffer of mine to sleep over at my house, even though, my wife's here, I mean, but it just, and so it never occurred to me that somebody would feel kind of left out by that, but I certainly understood once it was explained to me why. Again, the optics of it was I'm inviting a male employee to, and he actually wasn't even one of my staffers, but leave it at that. That I was creating a relationship with him, that I wouldn't with a female staffer. So these things happen, and I meant no animus, but it opened my mind to a greater awareness as a manager.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think, so I love that you're like, you're getting that awareness, and then for you to think about how can I create opportunity for the females, right? If
Yeah.
I know like the when I think about this all the time, right? Like if we're all biased, how do we kind of overcorrect, right,
Yes.
in our behavior and end up somewhere at the middle? So if I know that I'm naturally going to be connecting with sharing more intimate, by intimate I mean like, oh, insider information or whatever, like that doesn't feel, it's not like anything that's secret. Then how do I go out of my way to make sure that I'm doing that for people who are not like me?
Yeah, and crucially important, and I think to your point, we all need to be more aware, um, in all circumstances, and, as I went through it, I think, I became a better manager because and I appreciated, that people made me aware of these things, and I think it made me a better manager. I wanna thank you so much, I'm learning so much from you, I know that, the people that are coming to you are benefiting from your coaching. Um, Having said that, I understand you have an offering for those that are watching and listening today.
I do. So, I have an assessment. This is for women who are trying to rise to the next level of their leadership. It's an assessment. What's between you and your next level? And so we'll help you identify what is that next thing that you can move out of the way in order to rise. And so, for you, that could be clarity on exactly what that right next role is for you. For you, it might be, like we've been talking a lot about culture, like is your culture the right place? Right. But sometimes it's not even about your culture. It's about how you're showing up in your culture.
Yeah.
Do you have relationships with the right people? Are you perfectly positioned for that next level role that you want? Do you have the skills to be able to thrive and be strategic versus um, being overly busy and stuck in the weeds? So we'll help you identify what the next obstacle is so that you can clear your path and move more quickly into that next level role for you. You
Well,
can.
that's great. I mean, so many people will benefit from that. Thank you. And also, if people want to reach out to you and get more information about your consulting and coaching services, what's the best way to reach out to you and connect?
Yeah, you know what? Just shoot me a note, shoot me an email. It's Maya, Maya, at buildyourselfworkshop.com.
Terrific. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much. In my world, we call ourselves bully targets, but now let's aim to change the workplace for good for everyone, of any gender, to make it a place that's safe and a place that people can feel like they can move up comfortably and use their best efforts to do so. Maya, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Andy.